Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a world where kings ruled by divine right, peasants smelled faintly of damp hay, and lawmakers were mostly just making it up as they went along. So, if you're settling in for the night, go ahead and dim the lights. Let the world outside your room go quiet. Because tonight, we're curling up with the soft, parchment-scented absurdity of the Middle Ages, and the laws that only existed because someone did something so catastrophically stupid that the entire kingdom decided, right, never again. Just a small, quiet thing. If you like drifting off to strange corners of history, you can leave a like or subscribe. Quietly, of course. It helps the channel, and it tells me you'd like more sleepy stories like this one. But for now, just relax. Now, in theory, medieval laws were supposed to uphold divine justice. In practice, they mostly existed because one noble got drunk, set something on fire, or accidentally married a goat. And then Parliament, or the local lord, had to come up with an official rule just to make sure it didn't happen twice. So, let's start there. Let's drift back to an England of muddy roads, candlelight, and the faint sound of someone being accused of witchcraft for sneezing too loudly. The chicken trial of Basel. Our first stop is Basel, in what's now Switzerland, sometime in the 15th century, a quiet little town where someone decided to put a chicken on trial. Yes, a chicken. Apparently, the hen in question had laid an egg that was suspiciously unusual. Reports differ. Some said it was too round, others claimed it had strange markings, or, more ominously, that it was laid without a rooster's blessing. Which, I suppose, was the medieval equivalent of Immaculate Conception, but poultry edition. The townsfolk panicked. The church got involved. And because no one in the Middle Ages could ever admit they didn't understand something, the hen was charged with witchcraft. Now, in a stunning show of medieval legal logic, the bird was given a full trial. Witnesses were called. A priest argued that Satan had, quote, entered the hen's body. The defense, yes, there was one, argued that it was simply a chicken doing chicken things. The hen, you'll be relieved to know, was found guilty. It was burned at the stake, which is possibly the most expensive and least productive barbecue in European history. After that, local magistrates quietly introduced ordinances clarifying that only humans could be tried in court, an important rule, prompted entirely by the fact that they had already wasted a week trying to cross-examine a chicken. The Great Pig Panic of Fillets. While we're on the topic of animal jurisprudence, because apparently medieval Europe had a lot of it, let's wander over to Normandy. In 1386, a pig was publicly executed in the town of Fillets for murdering a child. It's a grim story, but also a very medieval one. The pig, a sow, had attacked and killed a small boy. The townspeople, in their infinite logic, decided that justice must be served, so they arrested the pig, dressed it in human clothing, and put it on trial before a magistrate. The pig was found guilty, naturally, and sentenced to death by hanging, in the town square, in full view of the public. The idea was to make an example of it, as though the other pigs would see the spectacle and reconsider their life choices. Afterward, Fillets introduced a new local law requiring that livestock be securely fenced at all times, particularly within town limits. A sensible rule, if you ignore the fact that it took a full murder trial to get there. And thus, somewhere in the dusty archives of French law, the first livestock control ordinance owes its existence to a single, homicidal pig. The royal beard tax. Let's drift a little east now, to Tudor England, where the only thing more changeable than the weather was the mood of the monarch. Henry VIII, the large and perpetually angry man who turned England upside down for the sake of his love life, famously introduced a beard tax. The story goes that Henry, who sported an impressive ginger beard, decided facial hair was a symbol of status. And naturally, anything that symbolized status should be taxed. So, a decree was issued, anyone wishing to wear a beard must pay for the privilege. Now, historians still debate whether the tax was real or more of an informal royal fashion fine. But what's certain is that Henry's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, reintroduced a similar tax later in her reign, because, of course, she did. And like most Tudor policies, it made very little sense. The amount varied depending on the person's social rank, and exemptions were granted, inconsistently. The only thing it really accomplished was creating a nation of men nervously shaving in the dark, in case the tax collectors came knocking. Eventually, the whole idea was scrapped, but not before Parliament passed a clarification that personal grooming shall not be subject to levy unless decreed by Crown. Which is bureaucratic code for, we had to write this down because Henry couldn't mind his own beard. The Don't Drown the Miller Law. Next, let's meander to medieval Germany, where, as it turns out, millers were not particularly popular people. Mills were essential for grinding grain into flour, but they also sat on valuable rivers. And since water rights were fiercely disputed, millers were often accused of diverting streams or charging unfair tolls. In one small German town, records suggest somewhere near Ulm, tensions boiled over when a group of villagers decided to solve their dispute by throwing the miller into his own mill pond. The man drowned, obviously, and the town council, perhaps realizing that this was bad for business, passed an ordinance forbidding the drowning of millers even when greatly provoked. It's one of those sentences that tells you everything you need to know about life in medieval Europe, the fact that they needed to specify even when greatly provoked. The cheese riots and the price of dairy. By the late 13th century, the English town of Stamford found itself in chaos, all because of cheese. The local guilds controlled dairy prices, and when one particularly greedy merchant tried to raise them beyond reason, the townspeople rioted. Cheese stalls were overturned. Barrels of curds were hurled into the river. There was, according to a surviving court record, a disturbance most foul, and of milk in way most grievous. In the aftermath, the mayor issued an ordinance stating that no cheese could be sold above a certain price, and that any merchant doing so would forfeit the cheese to the poor. Thus was born England's first official price control law, all because one man's Gouda greed got out of hand. The law against armored clergy. Now, drifting south into Italy, somewhere between Renaissance elegance and medieval absurdity, we find one of the more curious ecclesiastical laws of the period. Apparently, in several Italian city-states, priests had developed a worrying habit of wearing armor into battle. During the early 14th century, conflicts between rival families often pulled the clergy into military skirmishes. Some priests even carried swords for self-defense, though conveniently, self-defense often looked a lot like enthusiastic swordplay. Eventually, after one particularly disastrous street brawl in Florence, involving at least 2 friars and a bishop's nephew, the church declared it illegal for clergy to wear armor or bear arms in public. The edict was clear: those anointed shall not strike, nor be struck. Which, of course, they ignored. But still, the law stood. And the reason it had to be written down at all was, quite literally, because too many priests kept showing up to Mass wearing chainmail. The cursed shoes of Burgundy. And finally, for this first stretch of our journey, let's glide over to Burgundy, where fashion once became a matter of law. In the late 14th century, Burgundian nobles developed a taste for absurdly long shoes, polaines, they were called, with pointed toes so long they sometimes had to be tied to the knee with strings just to walk. They were considered the height of elegance. Which meant, naturally, that someone immediately took it too far. One lord, the Duke of Burgundy's cousin, reportedly wore polaines over 2 feet long. During a court ceremony, he tripped on them and fell headfirst into a candle display, setting his robe, and part of the drapery, on fire. No one was seriously hurt, but the embarrassment was enough for the Duke to issue a decree limiting shoe length to no more than twice the breadth of the foot. It became one of Europe's first sumptuary laws, rules about what people could and couldn't were based purely on fashion scandals. And that one incident, of a nobleman toppling into the candles like a human torch, was the reason everyone's shoes suddenly got much shorter. As we drift toward the next section, you can almost imagine the pattern here, one ridiculous event at a time, slowly shaping the medieval world into something that at least looked like order. A chicken's trial gave us legal limits. A pig's execution gave us livestock control. And one pair of cursed shoes gave us fashion regulation. History, it seems, isn't built on wisdom. It's built on someone doing something so monumentally stupid that the rest of us had to make it illegal. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, which, honestly, I doubt, we're floating further into the foggy corridors of medieval politics, where love was never romantic, marriage was never private, and every royal wedding came with at least one clause preventing civil war. In theory, these unions were meant to unite kingdoms. In reality, they usually united one miserable prince with one equally miserable princess, and then forced two entire nations to pretend it was going well. Tonight, we're exploring the strange, tragic, and occasionally absurd legal side of royal romance, the laws that only existed because someone, somewhere, loved very badly. The marriage by proxy disaster of Anne of Brittany. Let's start in France. Anne of Brittany was born in 1477, a duchess before she could walk, and, unfortunately for her, the most marriageable woman in Europe. Her duchy, Brittany, was strategically vital. Whoever married and got Brittany, too. Which meant she had about 6 marriage proposals before she hit puberty. At one point, she was married by proxy, which basically means someone else stood in for the groom, said the vows, and boom, congratulations, you're now a duchess wife to a man you've never met. The chosen husband was Maximilian of Austria, who, to his credit, was probably very polite about it. Unfortunately, the French crown was not polite about it. France considered the proxy marriage an act of treason, since it effectively handed Brittany over to the Habsburgs. So King Charles VIII invaded Brittany, annulled the proxy marriage on the grounds of political inconvenience, and then, you guessed it, married Anne himself. That single debacle led to a new French law forbidding proxy marriages without royal consent. Because, apparently, they needed to make it explicitly illegal to get married by mail order to an enemy emperor. And, for her part, was widowed at 21 and forced to remarry Charles's cousin, Louis XII. Her life became the legal precedent for what later lawyers called the inalienable marriage of the duchy, which basically meant, once you marry France, you stay married, whether you like it or not. The papal annulment of Henry VIII. Of course, no discussion of marital legislation would be complete without England's favorite romantic disaster, Henry VIII. You know the story. He wanted a son, his wife Catherine of Aragon didn't provide one, and instead of accepting his fate like a reasonable monarch, he decided to start an entire new religion. But the legal twist here is fascinating in its own dry, bureaucratic way. Henry's first marriage was technically valid under papal dispensation, meaning the Pope had personally signed off on it because Catherine was his late brother's widow. When Henry wanted out, he argued that the original dispensation was invalid. The Pope disagreed. Loudly. Henry's response was to pass a law, the Act and Restraint of Appeals in 1533, which declared that this realm of England is an empire, and therefore the Pope had no authority to meddle in its domestic affairs. It was, effectively, a breakup letter written in legal Latin. The result? The Church of England was born, monasteries were destroyed, and everyone else's marriages suddenly became a matter of royal law instead of canon law. All because one man couldn't take no for an answer. The tragic union of Joanna the Mad. Now, let's drift south to Spain, and meet Joanna of Castile. Joanna, known unfairly as the Mad, was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the same royal duo who funded Columbus's questionable voyage. She was married off to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, a man who, true to his nickname, was beautiful but utterly unbearable. Philip and Joanna's marriage was passionate, toxic, and ultimately catastrophic. She adored him, he cheated on her constantly. When he died unexpectedly, Joanna refused to let his body be buried. She traveled across Spain with his coffin, insisting he might wake up. The Spanish court panicked. Not out of compassion, out of succession concerns. They declared her mentally unfit to rule and passed a special law: no monarch could govern in absence of sound mind, proven by 3 councils of faith and reason. It was the first formal legal definition of royal insanity, created purely because one grieving queen wouldn't let go of her dead husband. And so, thanks to Joanna, Spanish law officially separated the throne from the person, an idea that would echo centuries later when similar regency acts were adopted across Europe. Sometimes, the most heartbreaking stories leave the most practical legacies. The bed test law of Naples. Now for something a little more absurd. In 15th century Naples, royal marriages were often arranged to secure alliances, but consummation, the final confirmation, was legally required for the marriage to be valid. Which sounds simple enough until one particular union between King Ferdinand II and Joanna of Aragon, yes, another Joanna, went oddly. Rumors spread that the marriage hadn't been consummated. Political rivals used this as ammunition to challenge Ferdinand's legitimacy. So the court issued a law, the Consummation Verification Act, stating that royal marriages could be legally witnessed by appointed courtiers to prove completion. Yes, witnessed. This mortifying rule, mercifully, didn't last long. But it did result in one official report noting that the union was duly and vigorously confirmed. Which may be the most awkward government document in history. The law was quietly repealed within a decade, though, reportedly, not before at least one unfortunate official fainted on the job. The Danish Marriage Permission Act. Drifting north, we reach Denmark in the 17th century, where the royal family was so entangled with itself that they had to start making laws just to keep track of who was legally allowed to marry whom. King Christian VII, who suffered from mental illness, was married off to Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, George III's sister. Their marriage collapsed spectacularly when Caroline fell in love with the royal physician, Johann Struensee. When their affair was discovered, the entire Danish court had a collective breakdown. Caroline was banished, Struensee was executed, and the council introduced a sweeping new marriage law forbidding royal unions without approval from both the crown and the clergy. It was meant to prevent scandal. Naturally, it only encouraged it. Future generations kept marrying their cousins anyway, because at some point, the European nobility stopped seeing the problem. Still, the Royal Permission Act of 1772 technically survived for centuries. It's the reason why, even today, certain European monarchs still require government consent to marry, a faint echo of one deeply unfortunate love triangle. The accidental bigamy of Philip II. And now, we drift to one of the most unintentionally illegal marriages in royal history. Philip II of Spain, the dour and devout ruler behind the Spanish Armada, was a man who took law very seriously, except when he didn't. When his first wife, Maria of Portugal, died, Philip remarried his cousin Mary Tudor, the Queen of England. Then she died, and he began arranging to marry another cousin, Anne of Austria. But due to confusing layers of papal dispensation, overlapping permissions, and, frankly, too much inbreeding to keep track of, it turned out that one of Philip's dispensations hadn't actually gone through properly. For several months, Philip was technically married to 2 women at once, on paper, at least, due to clerical error. Rather than admit this publicly, the Spanish crown quickly passed a new legal principle, the Royal Error Clause. It stated that no act of a sovereign, if made in good faith, shall be deemed unlawful. In other words, the king could not accidentally commit bigamy, because he was the king. A convenient law, if nothing else. The Swedish unwanted fiancé law. Finally, let's wander up to Chile, pine-scented Sweden in the 14th century, and meet Margaret, Queen of Denmark, Norway, and eventually Sweden, known as the Semiramis of the North. Before she became the power behind the Kalmar Union, young Margaret was engaged at age 6 to a boy she'd never met. When the time came to marry him, she allegedly burst into tears and refused. Her family forced the match anyway. It went as badly as one might expect. When she eventually rose to power, she introduced a quiet little amendment to the royal statutes. No union shall be contracted for the sovereign or heirs without the consent of the contracting party, in word and will. It was, essentially, the first law requiring consent in royal marriage. A small, humane moment in an otherwise cold and bureaucratic world. All because a terrified little girl once said no, and a queen remembered what that felt like. And so, as the candlelight of this chapter fades, we can see the pattern again. One heartbreak at a time, one political scandal at a time, Europe slowly invented the legal idea of personal choice, legitimacy, and royal accountability. Each of these laws came from somewhere, a moment of panic, a flash of cruelty, or the quiet defiance of a single person who refused to follow the script. In the end, the laws of love in medieval Europe weren't about romance. They were about control, and the faint, flickering hope that chaos could be contained by parchment. Let's drift onward, then, to part 3, where we'll explore the bizarre medieval laws of food, drink, and daily life, from bread so regulated it had its own police, to the world's first official rule about how many times you could toast someone at dinner. Hey everyone! Welcome back. If you're still awake, which, frankly, would be impressive, we're now floating into the warm, smoky world of medieval daily life. Forget kings and queens for a moment. Forget the castles. This is the story of the laws that govern ordinary people, the bakers, brewers, innkeepers, and weary peasants who somehow survived a system that regulated everything from the price of bread to how many guests you could invite to dinner. Because medieval Europe, for all its chaos, really loved rules. Especially ones that made no sense. So let's settle in. Maybe picture a flickering tavern fire, the clink of pewter mugs, and the quiet comfort of knowing that, no matter how strange the world feels, at least no one today is facing a trial over cheese weight. The bread police. Our first stop is England, around the year 1266, the reign of Henry III, a man so unremarkable that even his laws seemed embarrassed to exist. That year, Parliament passed one of the most oddly specific decrees in history, the assize of bread and ale. It sounds like a festival, but it was actually deadly serious. The law established exact rules for how big a loaf of bread should be, depending on the price of wheat that week. If you were a baker, you had to check official grain prices, consult a conversion chart, and adjust your loaves accordingly. Sell one that was even slightly underweight, and you could be fined, pilloried, or, in serious cases, have your oven destroyed. To enforce all this, the king appointed local bread inspectors, charmingly known as ale-conners and bread weighers. Their job was to wander through town, poking at dough and sipping beer, to ensure neither was fraudulent. It's one of the earliest examples of consumer protection law. But mostly, it was an excuse for medieval bureaucrats to get paid for drinking in public. Still, this strange system lasted for centuries, and every baker in England lived under the watchful, flour-dusted eye of the bread police. The ale-conners of London. Speaking of beer, let's stay in England a moment longer. The ale-conners, those cheerful, self-appointed quality inspectors, had a very specific method of testing ale. They would pour a small amount of beer onto a wooden bench, sit down in their leather breeches, and wait. If their trousers stuck to the bench after a minute or two, the ale was deemed strong and properly brewed. If not, if the seats stayed clean, the brewer was fined for watering down the drink. This might sound like a joke, but it's actually documented in London civic records. There are even references to ale benches being kept specifically for testing. The method, known as the stick test, somehow remained in use for over 200 years. So yes, for 2 centuries, England's official beer quality control system involved men sitting in puddles and hoping to get stuck. The forbidden foods of Lent. Let's drift south, to the warmer kitchens of medieval France and Italy. Religion ruled nearly every aspect of diet in the Middle Ages, especially during Lent. Eating meat was forbidden for 40 days. Fish was allowed, but people quickly began to exploit that rule in spectacularly creative ways. For example, beavers. Yes, medieval theologians declared that since beavers had tails and spent time in water, they counted as fish. So during Lent, pious nobles happily feasted on roast beaver tail, entirely guilt-free. Soon, otters, puffins, and even barnacle geese joined the technically fish category. One bishop even declared that barnacle geese, which were believed to grow on trees, don't ask, could be eaten during fasts because they descend not of fleshly birth. It got so out of hand that by the 14th century, the Vatican had to clarify, in writing, that mammals are mammals, regardless of how much time they spend swimming. And so, a papal decree was issued banning the consumption of beavers during Lent. Somewhere in the archives of Rome, there's still a legal record, in Latin, confirming that the beaver is not a fish. The law of the drunken banquet. Next, let's drift east, to the grand wooden halls of medieval Poland, a place where feasts could last days and hangovers were practically a form of national identity. The Polish nobility, or szlachta, loved a good banquet. Unfortunately, they loved them so much that entire estates went bankrupt trying to outdrink one another. In the 15th century, after one disastrous wedding where several lords allegedly passed out in the snow, the king passed a decree known as the Sobriety Statute. It limited the number of official toasts at any noble gathering to just 3. 3. That's it. If you toasted a 4th time, the fine was a full silver mark, enough to buy a small herd of pigs. Of course, this didn't stop anyone. But it did create one of Europe's earliest public intoxication laws, and inspired similar rules in Hungary, Bohemia, and Lithuania. It's comforting to know that even in the Middle Ages, some laws were just polite suggestions. The law of no garlic before church. Now, across the Alps into Italy again, specifically Siena, in the 13th century, where we find a rather charming piece of civic regulation. Apparently, citizens kept showing up to church after breakfast, reeking of garlic. So the city council, in a rare act of olfactory mercy, passed a law forbidding anyone from consuming garlic, onions, or leeks within 2 hours of Mass. Violators were fined 2 denarii, roughly the price of a loaf of bread, and publicly shamed as offenders of holy scent. Records show that the law was actually enforced, particularly during feast days. It's a small, almost endearing glimpse of medieval life, the struggle between human appetite and communal tolerance. And yes, people still broke it. Because garlic bread has always been worth the risk. The cheese weighers of Parma. In northern Italy, meanwhile, the Parmesan cheese industry had become so vital that it needed legal oversight. By the 14th century, Parmigiano Reggiano was already famous, and local officials guarded its quality like a sacred relic. They appointed cheese weighers, whose job was to ensure that every wheel met the proper standards of weight, density, and flavor. Anyone caught cutting corners, literally, could be fined or even exiled. One merchant in 1377 was found guilty of selling imitation Parmesan made from goat's milk. His punishment? Publicly humiliated and forced to eat the entire counterfeit cheese before the crowd. The crowd reportedly cheered. And so, to prevent further crimes against dairy, Parma established an official cheese court, complete with written statutes, seals, and inspection marks. To this day, modern Parmigiano still carries a stamp of authenticity, the direct descendant of that medieval law. The sumptuary laws of table manners. Back in England, laws didn't just tell people what to eat, they dictated how to eat. Sumptuary laws, originally intended to control luxury, eventually extended to the dinner table. For example, only nobles of a certain rank could use pewter utensils. The truly elite were allowed silver. Everyone else had to stick with wood. There were also rules about napkins, the number of dishes per meal, and even how loudly one could chew in public. In 1463, Edward IV issued a proclamation against excessive and riotous feasting, specifying that no one below the rank of baron could serve more than 2 courses at dinner. The law was, predictably, ignored, but it's one of the earliest known attempts to legislate table manners. So, if your parents ever told you not to talk with your mouth full, they were quoting a 15th century statute. The law of bread without salt. Let's end this chapter in Tuscany, with a story so petty it became legend. In the 12th century, Pisa and Florence were rival city-states, bitter enemies locked in endless feuds over trade, taxes, and pride. At one point, Pisa decided to punish Florence by blocking its salt supply. It was a political move, but it caused a culinary crisis. Florentine bakers, unwilling to give Pisa the satisfaction of victory, simply stopped using salt in their bread. The result was pain siaco, saltless bread. When peace eventually returned, people tried salted loaves again, and decided they didn't like them. The bland version had become tradition. To protect it, the City Council of Florence passed a decree forbidding the use of salt in official Tuscan bread. And so, to this day, Florentine bread remains saltless, all because of a centuries-old act of economic spite. And that's the strange beauty of medieval daily life. The smallest things, bread, beer, garlic, cheese, were all wrapped in layers of law, ritual, and stubborn pride. Each rule, each fine, each absurd proclamation was a glimpse into a world both alien and familiar. A world trying, in its own clumsy way, to make order out of appetite. We had the bread police. The garlic patrol. The ale conners stuck to their benches. And somehow, out of all that nonsense, came the beginnings of modern food regulation. It's oddly comforting, really. Even then, humanity's greatest problem was just trying to keep dinner from getting out of hand. Let's drift onward to part 4, where we'll explore medieval punishments so weird they had to be outlawed. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, impressive, you're about to hear what happened when medieval authorities ran out of reasonable ideas. Because while modern justice has its flaws, at least no one today is sentencing people to a day as a scarecrow or banishment to the duck pond. Yes, those were real. Medieval punishment was, more often than not, an improvisation, part moral theater, part comedy, and part unhinged performance art. Let's begin. The case of the talking corpse. Our first story comes from 9th century Italy, the infamous Cadaver Synod. Pope Stephen VI, already halfway down the spiral of political insanity, decided to put his predecessor on trial. The problem? That predecessor, Pope Formosus, had been dead for 7 months. Stephen had the corpse exhumed, dressed in papal robes, propped up in a chair, and formally charged with perjury and usurpation. A terrified deacon was assigned to speak on the corpse's behalf. The verdict, shockingly, was guilty. Formosus' body was stripped, mutilated, and tossed into the Tiber River, which, I suppose, was one way to clear a backlog of cases. The scandal horrified everyone, and soon a law was passed forbidding the trial of corpses. It's still technically illegal, in Vatican canon, to prosecute a dead person, all thanks to one pope who couldn't let an argument die. The ducking stool. Now let's float, quite literally, north to England, where women accused of scolding or gossiping were subjected to a punishment that was supposed to be corrective, but was really just cruelly creative. The ducking stool. The accused woman was tied to a chair attached to a long wooden beam, swung out over a pond or river, and dumped repeatedly into the water. It was believed the shock would cool her temper. More often, it just made her cold and furious. Over time, the practice became so common, and so widely mocked, that by the 17th century, English law quietly banned its use. The final recorded ducking in Britain was in 1817, when a woman in Leominster was plunged into the water before a crowd that reportedly cheered, and then awkwardly dispersed when they realized it was no longer legal. Somewhere in the statute books, there's still a clause describing the illegal immersion of women in corrective seating. A poetic way to say, we've learned, hopefully, to leave gossip alone. The shaming parade. Medieval punishments loved spectacle, and few were more humiliating than the shaming parade. In Germany and France, petty criminals were forced to march through town wearing ridiculous outfits. Bakers who cheated customers wore loaves of bread strung around their necks. Butchers who sold spoiled meat carried their rancid wares on a stick. And adulterers were sometimes made to wear matching donkey ears. One butcher in 14th century Cologne reportedly fainted under the weight of his own rotten sausages, a sentence that the local council later banned as inhumane and unsanitary. So a new rule was introduced: public humiliation must not involve perishable goods. A small mercy, but progress nonetheless. The trial by cheese. Over in medieval France, justice often relied on divine intervention, particularly in rural courts that lacked, well, evidence. In some regions, accused thieves could choose to undergo a cheese trial. A piece of consecrated cheese was placed before the accused, who had to eat it while reciting a prayer. If they choked or coughed, they were guilty. If they swallowed cleanly, they were innocent. Simple, really. Until, inevitably, someone choked for reasons unrelated to guilt, like nerves or bad dairy. After a particularly tragic misfire in the 13th century, the Bishop of Beauvais declared that foodstuffs are unfit for divine judgment. A sentence that could honestly apply to most medieval cuisine. The whipping boy. Next, let's wander to the royal nursery, because, as it turns out, even royal children had laws governing how they were punished. In the 16th century, English princes were considered too sacred to be physically disciplined. So, they were given whipping boys, other children of noble birth who were punished in their place. If the prince misbehaved, the whipping boy was beaten while the prince was made to watch. The idea was that guilt by sympathy would teach moral responsibility. It didn't. King Charles I, who had a whipping boy named Mungo Murray, reportedly laughed during his friend's punishments and later sent him gifts as compensation for divine inconvenience. Eventually, by the 17th century, Parliament banned the practice, declaring that no correction may be borne by proxy. A long-winded way of saying, maybe punish the person who actually did the thing. The drunk pig ordinance. In parts of medieval Germany, particularly Bavaria, pigs and goats were known to wander freely through town, which was fine until the taverns started giving them ale. Yes. Farmers, in a mix of boredom and dark humor, sometimes got their livestock drunk for sport. The animals would stumble into markets, knock over stalls, or wander into churches. So in 1467, the city of Regensburg passed the Drunken Animal Ordinance, prohibiting the giving of ale, wine, or beer to beasts of the field. The first recorded offender was fined 3 pfennigs and sentenced to clean the streets of vomit, both human and otherwise. And thus, the world's first animal sobriety law was born. The scold's bridle. If we return to England, and we probably should, because England never disappoints in this department, we find one of the more unsettling inventions of medieval justice, the scold's bridle, or brank. It was an iron cage that fit over a person's head, with a metal bit that pressed down on the tongue to prevent speech. Originally used on people accused of spreading rumors or blasphemy, it became a favorite tool for silencing women considered disruptive. It was, essentially, state-sponsored cruelty disguised as morality. The practice spread across Britain and parts of Scotland until 1824, when a law formally declared it contrary to public decency and divine mercy. For once, a rare instance where law actually caught up with basic humanity. The law of the bell ringer's pants. Not all punishments were cruel. Some were confusing. In 14th century Flanders, a bell ringer fell asleep during Mass, missing the hour to sound the morning bells. The townspeople, scandalized by this act of negligence, hauled him before the magistrate. His sentence? He was forced to ring the bells naked, wearing only a garland of nettles, while proclaiming, "May I never sleep on duty again." It was considered a fittingly embarrassing punishment. Unfortunately, it caused such a commotion that local clergy complained of improper nudity disturbing devotion. A week later, a law was issued forbidding penal exposure in places of worship. You'd think that wouldn't need clarification. And yet, it did. The singing executioner. One last, hauntingly strange story before we drift onward. In 15th century Prague, the city executioner was a man known only as Jan of the Bells. He had a peculiar habit. He sang during executions. Softly, tunelessly, often hymns, sometimes lullabies. Witnesses said it was unnerving, yet oddly merciful. The practice became famous enough that condemned prisoners began requesting his services specifically, believing it would ease their passing. Eventually, the church intervened, declaring that the executioner shall perform his office in silence, lest song be mistaken for sacrament. And just like that, it was outlawed, the only recorded law in Europe banning the singing of executioners. Strange, gentle, and grim. A perfect reflection of medieval justice itself. When you look back, it's almost poetic. How many of these laws began as acts of chaos and ended as gestures of conscience? A pope on trial for crimes committed in death. Women silenced for speaking their minds. A bell ringer stripped for sleeping in. A hangman who sang too sweetly. Each absurdity left a trace, a tiny scar in the legal record of a world slowly learning what not to do. And if there's a pattern here, it's this: medieval law wasn't about order. It was about reaction. Someone went too far, and society quietly scribbled in the margin, "Let's not repeat that." As the candles burn lower, let's drift to part 5, where we'll close our journey with the forgotten laws of death, decay, and the afterlife, the quiet, chilling rules written to govern what happened after you were gone. ChatGPT said. Excellent, we'll continue the Sleepless History series seamlessly. Let's lower the candlelight again, settle back into that calm, slow rhythm of storytelling. Tonight, we drift from dusty laws and absurd punishments into something quieter, darker, and far more delicate: the fine art of court intrigue and poison in the medieval world. Studio Microphone Part 5, Court Intrigue and Poison in the Middle Ages. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you've been here for the last few nights, you know the pattern by now. Someone in the Middle Ages does something ridiculous, and the rest of society invents a rule to stop it from happening again. But tonight's story is a little different. Because in this one, no one wanted to get caught, and no law could ever quite keep up. We're drifting into a world of whispered secrets, quiet meals that ended too suddenly, and royal courts where a cup of wine was both a blessing and a threat. So, let's begin, softly. The poisoner's table. In every royal court of medieval Europe, there was one job no sane person wanted: the food taster. A noble position in name, but mostly a waiting game between meals and mortality. The taster's task was to sample the king's food and drink before it reached the royal lips, in case someone had laced it with poison. And since most poisons of the era were slow or subtle, it didn't always help. You might taste the stew and feel fine. Then, 3 hours later, the king collapses, and so do you. In the 14th century, King Charles VI of France, the one who sometimes believed he was made of glass, kept 3 separate tasters, one for bread, one for meat, and one for wine. All were required to take oaths before meals, swearing their hands were clean and their loyalty purer than salt. The salt, incidentally, was also tested. Because of course it was. The case of the Emerald Goblet. Let's drift over to Italy, where poison wasn't just a threat, it was an art. The Renaissance courts of Florence, Milan, and Naples were obsessed with antidotes, mystical stones, and powdered remedies. One legend tells of an emerald goblet that could neutralize any poison poured inside it. Of course, this was nonsense, but a lucrative kind of nonsense. Merchants sold fake emerald cups made of colored glass or glazed clay. In 1497, the Duke of Ferrara passed a law forbidding the sale of poison-cure vessels without ecclesiastical approval. Translation: stop selling snake oil to nervous princes. But people still believed. Catherine de' Medici herself owned a set of green glass flasks said to draw out death. She tested them on condemned prisoners, a charming early form of clinical trial. The results were inconclusive, but the legend endured. The perfumed assassin. Poison didn't always come in a cup. In medieval courts, scent was power. Perfumed gloves, pomanders, and oils were marks of luxury, and, occasionally, murder. One of the earliest recorded poisonings by scent comes from the court of Naples in the 13th century. A young noblewoman, accused of plotting against her husband's rivals, allegedly soaked her gloves in belladonna oil. Belladonna, meaning beautiful lady, dilates the pupils, and in higher doses, stops the heart. The poison worked through the skin, slowly. When discovered, she claimed she only wanted to smell divine. Naturally, the law that followed banned the infusion of toxins into scents or oils meant for bodily adornment. Which, I suppose, was a polite way of saying, no murder via perfume. The curious case of Eleanor Cobham. Now let's visit England again, where poison was always political. In 1441, Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, was accused of trying to poison King Henry VI using charms, potions, and unholy means. She never confessed, but that didn't matter. She had dabbled in astrology and owned a few suspicious vials, which, in the eyes of the court, made her guilty enough. Eleanor was forced to perform public penance, barefoot, carrying a candle, while the crowd jeered, and then imprisoned for life. Her case led to one of England's earliest poison statutes, outlawing not just the use of poison, but the mere possession of it by commoners or women of improper curiosity. That last phrase would haunt herbalists and midwives for centuries. The Medici dinner problem. Poison, for the Italian Medici family, was practically a love language. In Florence, 15th century politics revolved around feasts, and so did assassinations. A poisoned fig, a spiced wine, a sugared almond, it could all be fatal. Cosimo de' Medici once remarked that he never ate anything that hadn't been blessed twice. One chronicler described his dining table as a battlefield of holy water and suspicion. At one point, Florentine law required all noble kitchens to keep a poison ledger, a list of ingredients and servants on duty, signed daily by the household steward. It sounds bureaucratic, but it was really a way to keep blame organized, because, in Florence, someone was always being blamed. The poison wardrobe. Let's move north again, to France, and one of the strangest institutions ever created, the Bureau de Poisons. It emerged in the late 1600s, during the reign of Louis XIV, after a string of high-profile poisonings swept through Parisian high society. This wasn't medieval anymore, but the spirit of the age hadn't changed: secrecy, ambition, and the occasional cup of something unpleasant. the Bureau investigated nobles, fortune-tellers, and alchemists who sold love potions and inheritance dust. Many of them worked from their wardrobes, literally. Aristocrats stored their powders and charms in perfumed cabinets beside their silks and lace. When the scandal reached the king's mistress, Madame de Montespan, the Sun King quietly dissolved the bureau and burned its records. But one law survived: no substance of alchemy or unknown tincture may be sold without the king's physician's consent. Essentially, no more poison boutiques. The death of King John. Not all poisonings were subtle. King John of England, the one from the Robin Hood stories, supposedly met his end after eating a surfeit of peaches. Contemporary rumors claimed the fruit was laced with venom, though modern historians suspect it was just dysentery. Either way, it sparked a royal panic about food safety. Monks at abbeys began keeping herb inventories, listing which plants were safe and which were suspect of the devil's art. The king's death even inspired a short-lived law requiring monasteries to bless their orchards annually, just in case. Because nothing says public health like sprinkling holy water on your pears. The emperor's antidote. Far from Europe, the Byzantine emperors had their own fascination with poison. Constantinople's court physicians were required to maintain a theriacarium, a chamber filled with antidotes and exotic ingredients, ready for use in case of sudden collapse. The grand antidote, called theriac, contained over 60 ingredients, including opium, cinnamon, myrrh, and ground viper flesh. It was meant to cure everything, though mostly it made people drowsy. Emperor Andronicos II reportedly took a spoonful every morning to strengthen his humors. After his death, the imperial physicians admitted they'd been replacing the expensive ingredients with honey and flour for years. No one noticed. Which says a lot about both medieval medicine and imperial trust. The witch's cup. By the late Middle Ages, poison and witchcraft had become indistinguishable. A woman caught with dried herbs could be accused of mixing deadly brews. In 1324, the case of Alice Keidler in Ireland became infamous, a wealthy woman charged with sorcery and the murder of her husband through powders of toad and skull. She escaped to England, but her servant, Petronilla de Meath, wasn't so lucky. She was burned, the first recorded witch execution in Irish history. The trial prompted the creation of new church decrees combining witchcraft and poisoning under one sin, veneficium. Poisoning, magic, and heresy, all wrapped neatly together. And it stayed that way for centuries. The sleep of the king. As the candle burns low, let's end with one of the quietest deaths in royal history, that of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. He died in battle, yes, but for years afterward, whispers claimed he'd been poisoned by his own physician, who simply gave him too much rest. It's the perfect epitaph for medieval poisoning, a slow, silent kind of power, hidden beneath etiquette, lace, and prayer. When you think about it, poison was the ultimate medieval weapon, not because it killed quickly, but because it killed quietly. It was invisible, elegant, and undeniable. The opposite of the battlefield, but just as deadly. And through it all, kings kept tasting their wine, priests kept blessing their fruit, and herbalists kept vanishing into the night. Because, in a world of crowns and suspicion, trust was the rarest luxury of all. Next, in part 6, we'll drift into the cursed crowns, dynasties that should have quit while they were ahead. A calm, bittersweet look at how royal families turned misfortune into a hereditary hobby. Welcome back. Tonight, we're staying in the same dim, echoing halls of power, but instead of poison in a goblet, the danger now comes from bloodlines themselves. Because sometimes, the curse isn't a spell or a potion. It's simply inheritance. The curse begins. Royal families love to believe they were chosen by God. But if you look closely, most of them were chosen by something far less divine: habit, desperation, and the occasional cousin marriage. For centuries, Dynasties across Europe clung to the idea that keeping the crown in the family kept the power pure. It also kept the gene pool rather small. And so began the long, slow saga of hereditary misfortune, the kind of curse you don't notice until everyone starts to look alike, act alike, and die strangely young. The Habsburg jaw. Let's start with the family that practically defined royal inbreeding, the Habsburgs. Their empire stretched from Spain to Austria, and their family tree looked less like a tree and more like a knot. They married each other so often that by the 17th century, their faces had become living family crests, long noses, drooping eyes, and that famous Habsburg jaw, so pronounced it could make eating difficult. Charles II of Spain, the last of his line, was the ultimate product of this dynasty. He was born physically frail, mentally unwell, and according to one doctor's record, without the strength to chew his food properly. When he died in 1700, the Spanish crown passed to another family entirely, the Bourbon dynasty, because the Habsburg bloodline had simply run out of health. People whispered it was a curse. In truth, it was just centuries of family loyalty taken a little too literally. The Tudors' ghosts. The English Tudors were luckier, for a time. Henry VII started the line with cautious ambition. Henry VIII nearly ended it through sheer appetite. But their real curse was not deformity or madness, it was fragility. Henry VIII's 6 wives in desperate quest for a male heir were not just vanity, they were the shadow of genetic anxiety. When his son Edward VI took the throne at age 9, he was brilliant but sickly, pale, coughing, and fading fast. His half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, would each reign in their own way, but neither left children. The Tudor line died quietly, like a candle that burned too bright and too fast. Some said it was divine punishment. Others called it poetic justice. But the truth? The Tudors were simply a dynasty built on luck, and history, always runs out. The madness of the Georges. Fast forward to the Georgian era, and we meet another royal affliction, madness. King George III of Britain, the same one who lost America, began showing signs of what modern historians believe was porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that causes severe mental instability and pain. During his worst episodes, he spoke for hours without stopping, sometimes believing he was talking to angels or trees. Doctors tried every treatment they could imagine, from bleeding him with leeches to making him drink soothing mixtures of arsenic. Nothing helped. And yet, through it all, the king's subjects called him Farmer George, because he loved simple things, gardening, clocks, and cows. Even as his mind unraveled, his gentleness never quite left him. A small, human mercy in an otherwise cruel inheritance. The Romanovs' fragile heir. Across the continent, another dynasty was collapsing under the weight of its own bloodline. The Romanovs of Russia, glittering, secretive, and doomed, carried a single, tragic thread, hemophilia. When Tsar Nicholas II's only son, Alexei, was born with the disease, even a bruise could turn deadly. Desperate for help, the royal family turned to a wandering mystic named Grigory Rasputin, a peasant healer who claimed he could calm the boy's bleeding through prayer. And, strangely enough, sometimes he did. Whether through hypnosis, luck, or a refusal to let doctors make things worse, Rasputin gained the trust of the Tsarina. And that trust, as history shows, would destroy them all. The empire crumbled in revolution, and the Romanovs' bloodline ended in a cellar, victims not of poison, but of fate. The Bourbon tragedy. In France, the Bourbon dynasty faced its own misfortunes. Louis XIV, the Sun King, ruled magnificently, but his descendants died like candles snuffed in a storm. Smallpox, measles, fever, entire branches of the family gone within months. By the time of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the family's claim to divine favor was so fragile it shattered under the first tremors of revolution. Their young son, the Dauphin, would die in prison, neglected, sick, and nameless. The French crown, once gilded with sunlight, ended in a basket under the guillotine. The Cape Tian curse. And then there's the eerie story of the Cape Tian curse, one of the most famous dynastic curses in medieval lore. In 1314, King Philip IV of France executed the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Jacques de Molay. Before his death, de Molay supposedly shouted a prophecy. Pope Clement, King Philip, within a year, you will stand before God's judgment. And he was right. Both men died within months. Over the next generation, Philip's sons each became king, and each died young, without male heirs. France was thrown into chaos, leading to the 100 Years' War with England. For centuries afterward, people whispered that the Templars' curse still haunted the French throne. A chilling coincidence, or just bad luck given a poetic name? The curse that wasn't. Sometimes, though, a so-called curse was simply the cost of power. Royal life was built on paranoia, confinement, and duty. Marriages were political, not personal. And every child born into a crown carried the weight of a kingdom, whether their body or mind could bear it or not. So when madness, frailty, or tragedy struck, people called it fate. But the truth is simpler. Kings and queens were just people, trapped in a game they couldn't escape. The sleep of dynasties. Dynasties are like candles, passed from one hand to another, each flame smaller than the last. Eventually, they flicker, sputter, and fade. And in that quiet darkness, history starts again, with someone new, claiming divine right and promising they'll do better. They never do. So as we close the book tonight, imagine those crowns resting on velvet cushions, waiting for their next owner. Heavy, gleaming, and cursed, not by magic, but by memory. Next time, we'll descend into something a little more physical and a little less royal. Part 7, The Plague Doctors, When Medicine Met Madness. Hey everyone! If you're still awake, or somewhere between waking and sleep, we're going to take a slow walk through one of the strangest corners of medieval history, medicine. Not the sharp, sterile science we know today, but the kind that smelled of rosemary, candle wax, and panic. Because in the Middle Ages, healing was not about knowing how the body worked. It was about convincing death that you were trying your best. The arrival of the plague. Let's start in the mid-14th century. Europe was just starting to breathe again after centuries of war, famine, and the usual feudal nonsense. Then, in 1347, ships arrived in Sicily carrying something small, invisible, and profoundly rude, Yersinia pestis, better known as the plague bacterium. Within a year, it had spread across the continent. By 1350, nearly a third of Europe was gone. Entire villages emptied overnight. There were no vaccines, no germ theory, and definitely no understanding of hygiene. So when doctors tried to explain what was happening, their guesses ranged from bad air to angry stars to sinful thoughts. Essentially, the medieval version of turning it off and on again. The bird-faced doctors. The image we all know, the long-nosed mask, black robe, wide-brimmed hat, didn't appear until the 17th century, long after the first wave of plague. But it became the symbol of the era's medical terror. The mask's beak was stuffed with herbs and spices, lavender, mint, camphor, and sometimes a few cloves, meant to purify the air. The theory was that disease traveled through miasma, or bad smells. So if you could make the air smell better, you might fool the plague into leaving you alone. It didn't work, but at least everyone around you could appreciate the effort. The uniform of fear. The full outfit was a masterpiece of misguided protection. A long waxed cloak to keep corruption from soaking in. Leather gloves and boots to avoid touching infected souls. A staff, partly for social distancing, partly for poking corpses from a safe range. The entire look was meant to project authority and calm. Unfortunately, it had the opposite effect. Imagine seeing that mask appear through the fog, tall, silent, bird-like, and realizing it meant someone nearby had just died. For many, the sight of a plague doctor wasn't reassuring. It was the official confirmation that the end had arrived. The cures. Medieval treatments were creative, if nothing else. Some doctors recommended bleeding, not because it helped, but because it was traditional. Others applied poultices of onions, crushed emeralds, or even pigeon feathers. One popular remedy involved holding a live chicken to the swelling and waiting for it to absorb the poison. Another advised sitting in a sewer, because the stronger stench would overpower the bad air. It didn't. Yet in a way, these efforts were deeply human, desperate attempts to bring order to a world collapsing into chaos. People needed to do something, even if it made no sense. The flagellants. Then came the flagellants, groups of people who marched from town to town, whipping themselves to atone for humanity's sins. They believed the plague was divine punishment, and that if they suffered enough, God might change his mind. Villages would line the roads to watch them pass, chanting, bleeding, and collapsing from exhaustion. It didn't stop the plague, but it did spread it faster. The irony was brutal. The doctors' records. Amid all this, some plague doctors left journals, quiet, methodical accounts of the horror around them. One from Florence simply wrote, "I have buried every patient I ever treated." Another from Marseille recorded his daily work. "Today, I drained 6 buboes. I do not think any will live. I will pray for them." Their calmness is haunting. It's the tone of men who had long stopped believing they could save anyone, yet still showed up every day to try. The religious debate. Of course, the church had its own theories. Some priests said the plague was a test of faith. Others claimed it was punishment for vanity, luxury, or simply not being poor enough. There were processions, prayers, fasts. Bells rang constantly. And when people realized the clergy were dying too, sometimes faster than anyone else, faith itself began to tremble. In the ashes of the plague, Europe's spiritual world changed forever. It was the beginning of doubt. And from that doubt, centuries later, came the birth of science. The survivors. When the plague finally receded, the survivors stepped into a quieter world. Fields lay empty. Cities smelled of smoke and decay. But strangely, there was opportunity. Wages rose, food was cheaper, and serfs began demanding better lives. The Black Death, for all its horror, broke the back of feudalism. In that silence after the storm, Europe began to rebuild, with fewer people, but with new ideas. The masks return. Centuries later, during new outbreaks, the plague doctor's mask reappeared. It became part superstition, part theater. Even when people knew it didn't help, they wore it anyway, as a symbol of effort, of control, of courage. It's oddly comforting to think that, in the face of death, humans always try to dress for the occasion. The slow recovery. By the 15th century, medicine was changing. Scholars began dissecting cadavers, a shocking act at the time, and discovered that bodies didn't operate by divine mystery, but by structure and cause. Hospitals improved, sanitation became a thing, and eventually, doctors stopped carrying dead chickens as medical instruments. Small steps, but real ones. The sleep of the healer. And so the plague doctor fades into memory, a strange, bird-faced symbol of fear and hope. He was never truly a villain or a savior. Just a man with a mask, trying to make sense of death with the tools he had. And maybe that's what makes him so human. Because we still do the same thing, in our own ways, trying to understand what scares us, one superstition at a time. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting into the stillness of a medieval scriptorium, a place where ink flowed like prayer, and silence was an art form. The monasteries of the Middle Ages were not glamorous. They smelled of candle smoke, sheepskin parchment, and boiled glue. The floors were cold, the bells rang at ungodly hours, and the food, if we're being charitable, was plain. And yet, it was inside those cold stone walls that civilization quietly survived. Because when the rest of the world was falling apart, the monks were writing. The Great Silence. Life in a monastery followed a rhythm older than kings. Morning bells. Prayer. Work. Study. More prayer. Sleep. Repeat. The monks took vows of silence, obedience, and humility, though humility was easier before your 200th bowl of lentil soup. They believed every moment of life was a form of devotion. And for many, copying manuscripts wasn't just labor, it was worship. Each letter was drawn with the same care as a prayer. Each page was a small rebellion against the forgetting. The scriptorium. Picture it. A long, narrow room. Stone walls, latticed windows, and narrow desks lined up in solemn rows. At each one, a monk sits hunched, quill in hand, the candlelight trembling over his shoulder. The only sounds, scratching, breathing, and the soft rustle of pages turned. They copied everything, the Bible, of course, but also Aristotle, Virgil, Galen, and any ancient text they could get their ink-stained fingers on. Sometimes they didn't even understand what they were preserving. They just knew it mattered. Without those monks, most of classical literature would have vanished. Philosophy, science, even stories, all of it survived because someone, somewhere, thought, I should write this down again. The ink in the vellum. The process was almost alchemical. They made ink from oak galls and iron salts. They prepared parchment by scraping animal skins until they were thin and smooth, then rubbing them with chalk. Every color had a ritual. Red was made from cinnabar, blue from lapis lazuli, crushed so fine it gleamed like heaven. Gold was laid with a brush of honey and egg white, shimmering like sunlight trapped on the page. A single manuscript could take years. And yet, they finished them, one careful breath, one careful letter at a time. Mistakes and margins. Of course, even saints make mistakes. Medieval manuscripts are full of little confessions, notes scribbled in the margins. My hand is tired. This page was hard. It is cold in the scriptorium today. Some added jokes, or doodles of cats chasing mice across the edges of holy texts. Others drew dragons, rabbits with swords, or monks sleeping through prayers. The margins became a quiet rebellion, proof that even in their devotion, they were still wonderfully, humorously human. The illuminators. If the scribes copied, the illuminators painted. Their job was to decorate, to fill the books with shimmering initials, saints, and vines that twisted into gold. They didn't just write about heaven, they painted it. Every glow of halo, every curling vine, was a reminder that beauty, too, was sacred. That art could be prayer, even when no one else would ever see it. Sometimes entire lives were spent painting a single book. And when it was finished, it was placed on a shelf, never to be owned, only to be read, quietly, by others who had also sworn away the world. Knowledge is resistance. During the darkest centuries of the Middle Ages, when war and plague made cities crumble, monasteries became islands of memory. The monks didn't build armies. They built libraries. They farmed, brewed beer, healed the sick, and copied the wisdom of ages. And by doing so, they kept the light of learning alive long enough for the Renaissance to find it again. It wasn't dramatic. There were no trumpets, no speeches. Just pens, patience, and faith that the act of remembering mattered. The solitude. Imagine the years, entire lives, spent in silence, bent over a desk. The rhythm of prayer blending with the rhythm of pen strokes. The smell of vellum, the cold stone pressing in from all sides. It sounds lonely. But for many monks, it was peace. They saw the act of writing as a conversation with eternity. Each word a thread, weaving the fragile mind of man into something that might last. The forgotten names. We remember the kings and warriors, but not the scribes. Their names rarely appear on their own work. Sometimes, though, one would leave a quiet mark at the end of a book. I wrote this. May God remember me. And in a way, he did. Because we still read their work. We still say their words. They've been gone for 1,000 years, but the sound of their pens, that steady scratching in the candlelight, still echoes in every library, every book, every story. From monks to machines. Centuries later, the printing press would take their place. Gutenberg's invention spread knowledge faster, wider, and cheaper than ever before. But the old manuscripts didn't disappear, they became treasures. Monks had worked for lifetimes to preserve them, and now the world could finally read what they had saved. It was the end of an age, and the beginning of ours. The sleep of scribes. So tonight, if you're still awake, imagine them. Rows of monks in brown robes, candles flickering, 1,000 miles of words flowing from quills. They didn't seek glory. They didn't seek power. They simply refused to let knowledge die. And because of that, the world didn't. Hey everyone. If you've made it this far, your mind is probably floating somewhere between curiosity and sleep, the perfect state to meet the dreamers of the Middle Ages, the alchemists. They weren't quite scientists, not exactly mystics, and definitely not practical. But they were something the medieval world didn't often allow, imaginers. They looked at the world and believed that everything could be changed, if only you whispered to matter in the right language. The promise of gold. It started with a simple idea. That all metals were imperfect versions of gold. Lead, tin, iron, these were base, unrefined, still on their way to divine perfection. And with enough heat, prayer, and patience, maybe, just maybe, you could finish what creation had started. Gold wasn't just valuable. It was seen as pure, eternal, incorruptible, the physical form of heavenly perfection. So the alchemists weren't just greedy. They were, in a strange way, spiritual. They wanted to turn corruption into eternity. The Philosopher's Stone. You've heard of it, the mythical Philosopher's Stone, said to transmute base metals into gold and grant eternal life. To the alchemists, it wasn't just a rock or powder. It was the symbol of enlightenment, the key to unlocking the universe's hidden harmony. Some said it glowed with its own light. Others said it could heal any wound or illness. A few, more practical ones, just hoped it would pay their debts. Many died searching for it. None succeeded. But in their failures, they stumbled on something far more real, the beginnings of chemistry. The alchemist's workshop. Picture the scene. A cramped stone room. Shelves stacked with jars of powders, herbs, and things that definitely shouldn't be next to an open flame. A furnace burns in the corner, called an athanor, or eternal fire. The air hums with the scent of sulfur and vinegar. A man in worn robes leans over a glass vessel, eyes half mad from smoke and hope. He stirs a bubbling mixture and mutters a prayer in Latin. This wasn't science as we know it. It was half alchemy, half devotion. Every reaction, every shimmer of metal, felt like a message from the divine. Hermes and hidden knowledge. The alchemists saw themselves as heirs to ancient wisdom, the secret teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, a mythical figure said to combine the knowledge of gods and men. To them, matter and spirit were the same thing, just viewed through different lenses. Transforming metal into gold was the same as transforming the soul from sin to purity. So their furnaces were altars. Their experiments were prayers. And their endless notebooks of symbols and riddles were, in a sense, meditations. The strange successes. For all their mystical nonsense, alchemists accidentally discovered quite a few things. They refined acids, invented distillation, created alloys, and gave us alcohol, which, in fairness, may have inspired half their revelations. They made the first pigments for glass, the first antiseptics, and even the first perfumes. The irony is that while they searched for immortality, they gave the rest of us medicine and chemistry. The famous dreamers. Roger Bacon, an English friar, believed that alchemy was the key to understanding nature itself. He wrote that science and faith weren't enemies, they were two halves of one truth. Paracelsus, the Swiss physician, took things further. He burned old medical texts in public and declared that medicine should serve the patient, not the professor. He experimented with mercury, opium, and minerals, often on himself, and laid the groundwork for toxicology. And then there was Nicolas Flamel, the Parisian scribe who legend claims discovered the philosopher's stone. In reality, he was probably just good at bookkeeping. But his tombstone became a symbol of mystery, centuries after his death. The language of symbols. Alchemy's great secret wasn't gold, it was symbolism. Every element, every stage of transformation, was described in riddles and animals. A green lion devouring the sun meant acid-dissolving metal. A black crow symbolized decay, a white dove, purification. This made their books almost impossible to read, which, conveniently, made them sound very wise. In truth, they weren't hiding knowledge. They were trying to describe what couldn't yet be measured. The Church's suspicion. Of course, the Church was not thrilled. Alchemy smelled of heresy, of people trying to play God. Turning lead into gold sounded suspiciously like magic, and magic was not on the approved syllabus. Some alchemists were executed. Others worked in secret, protected by noble patrons who enjoyed the idea of infinite wealth. Still, the pursuit continued, because hope is very hard to outlaw. The transition to science. By the 16th century, the line between alchemy and chemistry began to blur. Experiments became more systematic. Notes became clearer. And superstition began to retreat before observation. Alchemy had dreamed of perfection. Science settled for understanding. It wasn't as romantic, but it worked. The legacy. Every time you see a chemist in a lab coat, measuring, heating, recording, you're seeing a descendant of the alchemists. They might not pray to Hermes or believe in eternal life. But they still chase transformation, turning chaos into order, the unknown into the known. That same curiosity still burns, quietly, beneath the surface of reason. The sleep of the alchemist. So tonight, as the embers fade in our imaginary furnace, think of those lonely figures in candlelit rooms, murmuring to their flasks and believing they were speaking to the soul of the world. They never found the philosopher's stone. But in trying, they gave us something just as miraculous, the idea that the world can be understood.